like it's just built into the structure of reality, or I'm doing something wrong. So I'm really hoping that I'm doing something wrong, because if I am, then maybe I could fix it and I'd stop suffering. And it's something like that. And see, it's also, I think that if your life isn't what it could be and you're suffering, then it seems to me that that should be sufficient evidence that you don't know enough. And if that isn't sufficient evidence that you don't know enough, then I don't know how anyone else could provide you with that evidence. And so I'm going to leave it at that.
This is psychological rescue, not like rescuing someone who's drowning, for example?
Mm. Yes, you can rescue people when they're drowning even if they don't want you to.
Perfect.
I'll tell you something about that though. Something interesting about that, and that's relevant, is that, you know, I don't know how many of you know how you rescue someone who's drowning. You do it like this, right? You come to them like this. And you push them away with your foot. If they're, I'm telling you, that's what you do if you're a lifeguard. Because if they're panicking and they grab you, you both drown. And that's stupid, because then you both drown. Right? And that's a really good way, that's a really good metaphor for trying to help someone too. It's like when people are in real trouble, you know, some of it's they're confused and some of it is that their life has collapsed around them and there's some malevolence there and there's some desire for vengeance. It's just like one dangerous mess. And if you're going to wade in there unprepared, the probability that they're going to take you down compared to you elevating them is very, very high. You know, because you don't even know what your damn psychological stability rests on. You might be saying just because you're lucky and surrounded by sane people, that doesn't mean that you have the psychological wherewithal to really pull someone up from the depths of the underworld, especially if they've also got one foot in hell. So you should bloody well be careful about doing that kind of thing. It's hubristic to attempt it, and I would definitely caution people very carefully about trying to rescue someone who doesn't want to be rescued. It's very dangerous activity, and it can easily be counterproductive.
Okay, so since 2006, I've been trying to figure out, like, extract the meta, the way you've put it, of social justice warriors, and I think I found it. Actually, they seem to have this behavior where they nebulize every standard we have. So they take a standard you have that has full of criteria. They say what something is how it is. Like that's a podium, but it has these criteria within it that make it. Oh, sorry. They take they do something called nebulization, where they take something, a what, and they dissolve the criteria such that there is no way to say how it is. So you see this now with gender, where someone will say they're a gender, but there's no way to get logically from how they can be that gender, like how you can be an attack helicopter, or a male, or a woman, or something like that. But the thing that came from this, and I figured this out when I learned about you, is that nebulization appears to be the exact opposite process of individuation. It's the philosophical version of individuation that rests on three premises or three core axioms, which is I exist, which is an axiom that exists in the objective, that you exist here, and then I am, which is a reiteration or reincarnation of I exist, which is well, basically you have to say I'm right about having existed or else it just falls apart. And then you have as, which is the question begged from that. Well, if you exist and you're right, as what? And you're talking about God being the metaphor of God in Genesis being a metaphor for the creation of consciousness. And it appears that individuation actually fits that triad. Because if you take as, for example, the as it's the predictive aspect, where you try to take the subjective and make it objective. So you have an idea, you test it in reality, and time is the ultimate arbiter that determines these things. And it changes your understanding of reality. It lets you know God. It lets you know the objective. And then from that point, there's the subjective, which is supposed to be formed from objective reality. But because you've changed that, you now have to sacrifice your old self. The old way you saw Jordan Peterson of 10 years ago was not who he is now. So it gets sacrificed. And at the same time, you can point back to that guy, that Jordan Peterson, and say, well, that guy was wrong. And that's the scapegoating of the Son. So the subjective aspect, the I am right, is the Son, and then the Holy Spirit, which is supposed to lead you to God, is the as.
Okay, I don't understand the relationship between that and the first part.
Go.
So can you just clarify that? The social justice aspect and the nebulization.
Oh, the social justice is the exact opposite process of individuation. That's all it is. And it actually occurs at as. If you're at as and you're thinking, well, what am I? You either apply individuation, you try to apply criteria, you try to find out what you are in reality, or you refuse that paradigm and say, well, look, I'm always going to be right, I'm completely self-righteous, and you stop at that subjective aspect, where everything becomes subjective and you ultimately become relativistic and nihilistic. So I'm asking, have you considered that the Genesis tale and the creation myth and God is actually the process of individuation, and the Trinity is actually those three core premises, the three axioms that come from that?
Okay, I haven't considered that. I mean, I know that Jung drew a parallel between the idea of the passion, for example, and the development of human individuality. And so there's that idea is lurking inside the Jungian notion of individuation, because it has to do with voluntary confrontation with mortality and also with evil, right, as two of the key elements of genuine self-realization. I haven't considered the metaphorical pathway that you just described, so I can't comment on that. I'd have to think about that. But I could say that one of the things that does disturb me about the ideological battle that's going on right now, and I think this is a very deep part of it, and this is the part that's a battle against the logos in Derrida's old terms, right? The phallogocentric West needs to be taken down to its essence, is the refusal to engage in precise language. And I see that in part, for example, manifested in the refusal of the people who I'm criticizing to ever engage me in any debate. They don't believe in debate, and they don't believe in the let's say, the redemptive power of dialogue, because mostly what they believe in is power. So there's a nebulization in that manner. There's this tendency to hide behind what's vague and fog-like instead of making things sharp and clear and crystalline. And I do think that that's part of the degeneration of a civilization as far as I'm concerned. So
you haven't considered that then?
No.
Not yet. Would you please?
I'll do my best. I'll do my best.
Please.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Okay, so this is it. One more question, and then
I'll make it quick.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. My question is, I know you stated in the last lecture that the importance for setting aims in life and to kind of have goals to work towards, right? So my question was, how do you do that if you don't know where you want to go? Because that's kind of where I got stuck on your future authoring program. Because
okay, that's a good question. That's a really good question. I think it's echoed to some degree in the structure of the biblical stories, and in this manner. So there's this notion in the Old Testament that morality is following a sequence of prohibitions. There's a bunch of bad things you shouldn't do, and then basically you're good enough. And I think there's wisdom in that. I think that's kind of where children start, right? I mean, I love children and all that, but they're crazy little creatures, and they need to be, civilized. And partly what you do is you lay prohibitions on them, and mostly what you're trying to do is lay prohibitions on them for the behaviors that, if they manifested, would make their life miserable. So I have another chapter in this book that I'm writing called "Don't Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them." And the idea there is that your job as a parent is to help your children become the sort of 4-year-olds that adults genuinely smile at when they come into a room, because that makes the entire social environment both truthful and welcoming. And so your job is to make them desirable social beings, and a lot of that is prohibition. Okay, and there's this ethical transformation. It happens to some degree in the tradition of in the prophetic tradition, where there's a spirit that seemed, in some sense, to rise above the law. But there's a real transformation between the Old Testament and the New Testament, because the Old Testament is prohibition, and the New Testament is, well, here's the good things you do once you're more than merely prohibiting yourself from impulsive sin, let's say. There's a positive good to be accomplished. Well, you might say, well, I don't know what the positive good is. Fair enough, man. So this is why this thing that I've said to people has become this crazy internet meme, but that's to clean up your room, and which is a lot better and more useful than people think. It's a lot harder too, but the first thing you do, I think, and I learned this in part from Solzhenitsyn when he was trying to iron out his soul when he was in the Gulag, because he was trying to figure out how he got there, how he contributed to how he got there. Not Stalin and Hitler, even though they were kind of to blame, but there wasn't much he could do about that. I think what you have to do, and this is part of humility, is you have to look around you within your sphere of influence, like the direct sphere of influence, and fix the things that announce themselves as in need of repair. And those are often small things, and they can be like your room. Put it in order, because the thing is, it isn't exactly so important that your room is in order, although it is. What's important is that you learn how to distinguish between chaos and order, and to be able to act in a manner that produces order. And in most households, there's 100 things that could be done to just make it less hideous and horrible. And so practicing that it's a real useful form of meditation, and it's also, I think it's a divine act, because you're taking chaos. And you know, if you pay attention even to a room, it's so interesting. And I learned, because I've renovated many places now and tried to make them beautiful. And one of the things that I've really learned is that even if you own a structure, unless you've investigated all the nooks and crannies and cleaned them up and put your own imprint on them and made them yours, they're not yours. The mere fact of physical ownership doesn't make them yours. You have to establish a dynamic relationship with the objects before they're actually yours. And I think you can do something as simple as just sit on your bed and think, okay, there's probably like 5 things I could do today so that tomorrow morning is slightly better than this morning was, or at least I'm not falling behind. And those will usually be, it's like having to eat a toad in the morning, right? It's like, it's not going to be something you want to do. There'll be things you're trying to avoid. They're snakes, essentially. But if you ask yourself, like you're asking someone, which I think is a form of prayer, if you ask yourself, instead of telling yourself, you know, what is it that I could do to set things more right today, that I would actually do? It's usually some small thing because you're not that disciplined, you know. Then you can go do it. And then you put the world together a little more when you do that. And that spreads out. But you also construct yourself into something that's better able to call order forth from chaos. And that makes you just incrementally stronger. And then the next day, you can maybe take on a slightly larger task. And like, you get the benefit of compound interest if you do that. It's a tremendously powerful technique. And I think if you do that, at some point, instead of just having to fix things up that are not good, you'll start to get a glimmer of the positive things that you could do, you know, the positive things that you could do that would actually constitute a vision. And that's what I would recommend.
Thank you.